Mr. Smith is an executive director of the NFL Players Association, which is the union for NFL athletes. From his experience in this role, he'll be able to provide a unique perspective to the NCAA reform conversation from both the professional sports perspective as well as the organized labor perspective and how organized labor and sports can intersect. In addition, we'll definitely get around to asking him questions about NFL related matters, including this season, the crazy 2020 season that we're in right now, and the recent NFL CBA deal.
Before we jump in, just a quick background about the Duke Sports and Entertainment Law Society and the Future of College Sports Initiative. The goal of CELS is to learn about current legal topics in sports and entertainment, prepare students for careers in those fields. This event is also the third installment of the Future of College Sports series. Our first event happened back in March when we hosted a conference featuring several leading voices in the NCAA reform conversation, including ESPN college basketball analyst and Duke Law graduate Jay Billis, Representative Mark Walker, NCAA executives Donald Remy and Stan Wilcox, and several others. In addition, many of you may have joined us 2 Fridays ago when we hosted Senators Cory Booker and Chris Murphy to discuss their legislative proposal on the future of college sports. And finally, if you're interested in getting involved with our Future of College Sports initiative, we invite you to apply to be a Future of College Sports Fellow. We welcome all members of the educational community of all academic disciplines, not just law, and all universities, not just Duke. To join our group, please send us an email at futureofcollegesports@gmail.com.
Before we jump into our program today, we just wanted to give a quick shout out to the organizations that are sponsoring this event. As Justin mentioned, Duke's Sports and Entertainment Law Society, which is houses the Future of College Sports Initiative. So really grateful to CELS, and then also grateful to the Student Sports Law Network, which for those of you who don't know, is a brand new organization founded this summer of law students across the country who are interested in sports law and sports related issues in the legal realm. And so I highly encourage you to check out SSLN's website at studentsportslawnetwork.com. And a special shout out and welcome to all of you from SSLN, law students from other schools joining us here today. So here's how the program is going to go. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cari Grieb for an introduction. And then we'll have a great conversation with D. Smith about both the future of college sports and NFL related matters. And then we'll turn it over and have a Q&A segment at the end of the conversation, which will be moderated by the CELS co-president, Shira Levine. But first, Professor Cari Grieb, she's a partner in the Banking and Financial Services Department at Chapman & Cutler in their Chicago office. And she has experience representing both professional sports teams and banks and stadium finance transactions and other sports law matters in the MLB, NFL, MLS, just to name a few. She's a graduate of Duke Law and is also an adjunct professor at Northwestern and also here at Duke Law, where she teaches a winter session class on negotiating domestic violence policies and gender inequality reform in professional sports, which, as I imagine she'll touch on a little bit, is a topic she actually works with the NFLPA on quite a bit. So Cari, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hopefully this is working, or I think my video might be off. I'm not sure what I did. So, can everyone see me? Is it working? Zach, is my video working? It says it's not.
I can't see your video.
Hold on 1 second. Let me see if I can. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why it's not working. There we go.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Great to be back, even though virtually. I hope everyone is safe and healthy and is better with technology than I am. I barely can get to class on time when I attended Duke, let alone orchestrate something like this and organize this. So, you know, very impressed by everyone who made this event happen. So happy to see my friend Dee as well. Thank you for coming to Duke virtually. I know you're a big UVA fan, so we won't hold that against you.
Yeah.
So when Zach reached out, he said, can you give a 5 to 7 minute introduction on Dee? And I said, 5 to 7 minutes? That is not enough time. If we're going to cover the many accomplishments and the story career of Dee Smith, we need at least 27 to 28.5 minutes to go over that. So I decided, instead of going over his long list of accomplishments and accolades, I'd give everyone an insider's view as to the real D. Smith, his strengths, his major weaknesses, because I've known him now since 2016, so I can give everyone the inside scoop. So number one, D is not the best athlete. His two children, Elizabeth and Alex, are significantly better athletes. His son, Alex, in fact, plays lacrosse at Maryland. I'm not sure why he would choose Maryland over Duke, but he does play for the lacrosse team at Maryland. Number two, D's biggest weakness is he is a diehard UVA basketball fan. And really anything UVA other than UVA lacrosse, because he puts Maryland first. He loves UVA. I will say this, the last time D and I spoke at the same school together, it was UVA, and UVA went on to win men's basketball championship a few weeks later. So if history repeats itself, I'm feeling pretty good about Duke men's basketball this year. So D, thank you for joining virtually and coming to Duke. Number three, D is a huge underachiever. You may recognize, maybe not, some of the places that he's worked for prior to being unanimously elected executive director of the NFLPA in 2009, U.S. Attorney's Office, Department of Justice, no big deal. He was partner Latham and Watkins, Patton Boggs, where he was a litigation partner. Very, very big underachiever. But on a serious note, if someone said, Cari, how can you describe D if you only have a few words and about 2.5 minutes remaining in your intro? And I would say D is someone who fundamentally cares about people. And I don't just mean NFL players, which he certainly cares about, as he is the executive director of the Players Association, but he cares about people generally. So just to give you some examples, since first of all, when he took over as executive director, he inherited a very hostile, contentious labor management relations. And the improvements that he has won for the players have been so significant, especially in terms of player health, players insurance, and education benefits as well. I actually spoke with a former NFL player who's now retired a few weeks ago, and he was going on saying there is no better insurance than the insurance available for retired players who played at least 3 credited seasons. And he kept going on and bragging about the insurance. So I'm very sad that I will never qualify for the insurance that D has bargained for. But it's not just the NFL players he cares about. He cares also about athletes generally. 2016, after U.S. women's national soccer team filed a wage discrimination complaint with the EEOC, D, like all of us, read Google, read the news, got really interested in this case, and he reached out to his counterpart, the head of the U.S. Women's National Soccer Team Players Association, and said, what can I do to help? How can the NFLPA support you and help you? And that's what he does. He's been a champion of social causes throughout his tenure as executive director. And just, another thing that he cares about, and why I'm even speaking today, is D reached out to me in 2016 and said, Cari, I like to work with you to how can we improve racial, gender hiring practices in the NFL. And I have been so fortunate to have the opportunity to get to know D on a personal level in terms of, his athletic shortcomings, but also, we've been trying to figure out how can we improve hiring, not just of coaches and scouts on the field, but how can we also improve team front office and league front office positions across the board. So I'm going to stop talking because I've exceeded my 5 minutes allotted to me. But D, thank you for coming. I know this is not UVA, but we're so happy to have you. You've done so much for athletes, for people, and we're really excited to have you here today. So thank you.
Well, Cari, thank you very much. I probably should have second guessed doing this now that I'm in the midst of Blue Devil country. Well, first of all, you've been such a great friend to us. I know you've been a tremendous professor. What Cari didn't tell you was that the first time we met was when I was doing a presentation, I think at Fordham in New York, and someone, I took question and answers at the end, and someone came at the NFLPA and the NFL quite aggressively about its hiring practices, its diversity, how it was handling issues of domestic violence, and that was your professor. And I've never shied away from tough questions. I will say that then I wish I would have shied away from a few of those tough questions. But we've never had a problem with being held accountable. And I think in our profession as lawyers and certainly as law school students, the profession that you've all decided to undertake is literally about holding people accountable. And I want to thank Cari for holding me accountable that day and for continuing to be my friend, and certainly inviting me to an event that could possibly lead to a national championship for Duke, which could be the greatest horror of my life. So thank you for that. Thank you for doing that. I'm ready to go if you guys are.
Yeah, sounds great. So we can kick it off, Justin, with the question on your background and inspiration, and then from there, I understand you have a few slides that you'd like to share. So, Justin, you want to take it away?
Yeah, Cari mentioned your background in the attorney's office, U.S. Attorney's Office, and in private practice. I'm curious how your current role compares to your previous ones, and kind of where your inspiration comes from to continue in your role.
Yeah, great question, and thank you again to all of the students who've invited me today. Look, I really loved the job of being a prosecutor. It was something that I wanted to do when I was a relatively young in law school. I think that a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office and then a job at the Department of Justice puts you in the role of advocating for justice. There are times right now, without getting too political, whether I wonder whether some people at the Justice Department have forgotten what that mission is about. But when you are hired to try to achieve justice, I think it puts you in a rare role, especially as a young lawyer, of how to do the right thing each and every day. And that job as an assistant United States attorney was probably one of the best jobs I'll ever have in my life. I think I've been blessed with having, almost three careers. My wife would, interpret that as my inability to keep a job. But all of the jobs that I've had, I've tried to do the right thing by our clients, to do the right thing by our profession. And I think for a group of young people who are aspiring to become something more than just an employee, our job as lawyers is a profession. And what comes with that are things like fiduciary duties, professional responsibility, a sense to abide by an ethical code. And those things put all of us in a very unique position of how we are being asked to do our job, but also how we are asked to do that in the context of a profession. And I think it is still a noble profession. And I'm glad that people, here and you folks who have thought about something to bite off, like the future of college sports, to do that as a group of students, tells me that you're interested in something and interested in accomplishing something that's bigger and more important than just getting your degree and then just getting a job. All of you are, have committed yourself to trying to make the business of college sports better, hopefully better, for all the people who are in it.
On that note, I'd love to turn it over to you, Dee, and if you'd like to share, we can jump right into that future of college sports discussion.
I'm a big believer in what we do. I'm a big believer in how we frame things. The future of college sports has to start with how we view the individuals, and from my perspective, the most important individuals in college sports are the people, the men and women who are actually playing the sport. Where I always start off in this discussion is the language. And I'd like to start off with a picture and then a description. Nearly decades ago, a person named Ray Dennison, who was a former person who served in our military during World War II, caught the opening kickoff for the powerhouse of the Fort Lewis A&M. The opening kickoff was one that he took that also ultimately cost him his life. He died after a head-on collision as an athlete, playing college football, as a former service member. And Ray Dennison's story wouldn't mean much. In some respects, it might even be an asterisk to the way in which we view college sports today. But here was a young man who wasn't playing to generate a tremendous amount of revenue for his university, left a wife and a child, died playing a sport that we assume that he loved. But the reason why Ray Dennison is so important to me is each and every day, the NCAA, the announcers for the college sports, our universities, and sometimes even the parents of college athletes use a word student athlete as if it doesn't mean anything. In our world, we use student athlete as almost a term of reverence, a term that describes someone who is a student, yet an athlete. But the significance of Ray Dennison is after he died on that football field, his wife and his child received workers' compensation benefits. The precursor of the NCAA decided that the receipt of those workers' comp benefits nonetheless meant that they could have had a problem in college sports, that they could have been in a world where if someone gets injured playing college sports, that they could be subject to workers' comp benefits. And as a result of those workers' comp benefits, they could be in a world where athletes who get injured playing a college sport could nonetheless sue the universities that they were playing for. And that wouldn't be good for only one group of people. It wouldn't be good for the universities. So Ray Dennison was a person who lost his life playing a sport, won workers' comp benefits for his widow and his child. But as we see from the State Compensation Insurance Fund versus Industrial Commission, the Ray Dennison case generated litigation where the only thing at interest was whether or not his widow and his child would be entitled to workers' comp benefits for the death of her husband and the death of the child's father. And in this case, the precursor of the NCAA litigated this case like any other lawyer would, but decided that they would come up with a term, a moniker, something that would distinguish Ray Dennison from just being a student who therefore could have a liability claim against the university, a way of distinguishing Ray Dennison as a worker who might have a claim of liability against the university. And they came up with a term and a way of describing the late Ray Dennison as someone who was a student athlete. And because he was a student athlete, he wasn't a student. Because he wasn't a student athlete, he wasn't a worker. But most importantly for all of us, because he was a student athlete, he wasn't entitled, and his widow wasn't entitled, and his child wasn't entitled to workers' comp benefits. In this case, not only stood for the establishment of this term student athlete. The way that I look at it, it stands for a world where a group of people decided that it was more important to protect a university than to protect a veteran and a father and a husband. So every time I hear the word student athlete, and it is the only term in our house that we are not allowed to use, when I hear student athlete, I think of Ray Dennison. So today, we don't have a Ray Dennison Day. We don't have a Ray Dennison celebration. I think Ray Dennison's name is on a plaque somewhere. But the next time we hear the term student athlete, I hope that everybody here remembers Ray Dennison. Because to me, that's what frames not only what I think the core mission is going to be for everybody who talks about the future of college sports. For us at the NFL Players Association, we care about the person. And there's never going to be a day where I apologize for that. So we can kick off and we can take this anywhere you guys want.
All right. Yeah, thank you. That was a fantastic introduction and definitely gives some insight to the history behind the word student athlete and Ray Dennison's story. So thank you for sharing that with us. Kind of going off of what you had just ended with, the year 2020 has been a crazy year for everyone, but especially the NFLPA. First, as we'll touch on a little bit later, you guys went through a collective bargaining negotiation process earlier this year. And then obviously the 2020 season has brought a number of challenges and different maybe opportunities that we've never had before. So with all of that being said, does the NFLPA have the interest and capacity, in your perspective, to play a constructive role in reforming college athletics? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. Years ago, Cari told the story of really a group of people who I just love, the way in which we became involved with the U.S. women's national team. I also remember vividly a few years ago on our way to do the team meeting at the Chicago Bears, I think, we had some time to kill. And when we have time to kill, you can imagine it's a bunch of guys flying around the country to see players. We always eat. We just eat. We stopped at a restaurant. I grabbed the newspaper for breakfast. And on the front page of the sports section was a story about the quarterback of Northwestern University who had ridden out on the field with his teammates, but on the tape of his arm, he had written the words APU, All Players United. And it was the story of how those players decided that because some of them were being treated differently as undergraduate students versus graduate students, that they wanted to form a union so that they could confront the administration and talk about the disparity about how they were being treated. I'll tell you right now, when I saw that picture of Kane Coulter with that on his armband, I immediately called someone and said, we need to get in touch with Kane Coulter to find out how this organization can help them organize. Yeah, that was a little bit of just me loving it personally, but we inherit our athletes from the NCAA. So if there's a group of athletes who we believe are being treated unfairly, and we know that we not only inherit them from a minor league system that we'll call the NCAA, but we also inherit the injuries that they have. We inherit the unfairness by which they've been treated. And we know that while, nobody should feel sorry for NFL players, they have a large, aggressive union that doesn't apologize for being aggressive, that can represent them. We also know that the one thing that we inherit is a group of people who don't have that representation in college. So I can't imagine what it was like for a group of Northwestern football players to basically take on the NCAA on their own, when I sit at the titular head of a, multi-million-dollar union that takes on the NFL, and we have to fight in the same way that they fight, but we can do so with lawyers, resources, lobbyists, communications groups. So, for us to be able to help them and then to help NFLPA, the organization that's trying to unionize college players, I think it's our obligation to do so.
Off that point, in our first session this semester, the Future of College Sports session with Senator Chris Murphy, he mentioned that he's exploring on Capitol Hill how the experience and the relationship of sports unions could be relevant in providing a more effective voice for players. So from your perspective, as he and other policymakers are contemplating the potential role of unions in college sports, something that obviously there isn't right now, what thoughts or advice do you have to policymakers who are contemplating these decisions?
Well, my advice to them would be listen to the students. I think that let's just scratch the word think. When I was at Patton Boggs, I was certainly there not as a lobbyist, but as a trial lawyer, heading up the criminal division there and the corporate defense unit there. But what made Patton Boggs significant in the legal world was that it was probably the largest and most successful lobbying shop in the world. I know that policymakers are subject to lobbyists, and if we don't understand that, we just need to take off the Pollyanna-ish glasses and realize how laws and policymakers are impacted. I think that my message to policymakers should be listen to the students instead of listening to the lawyers hired by the NCAA. Because what their job is, frankly, is to measure out and level the playing field for a group of citizens who might not have the same level of representation that the NCAA has, given the millions of dollars that it can utilize and spend on lobbyists and lawyers. And I think if policymakers truly listen to the students, as opposed to the student athletes, I think that they will have a better understanding of what they need to do in order to make this system fair. And the first thing that they need to do is to be allowed, to allow groups of students to be powerful teams off the field in the same way that they are asked to be powerful teams on the field.
Now, professional sports are organized on a sport-specific basis. Obviously, you're only govern the NFL players, and there are different unions that govern different professional sports. Whereas college sports obviously are organized to embrace all sports, including men's and women's varieties. From your perspective, how do you think this difference in organizational structure impacts the process of athletes obtaining greater rights? And are there other ways besides the professional collective bargaining process to fairly allocate the resources generated by intercollegiate sports?
100%. And, that's a great question. I think that where the NCAA is most devious about how they approach the issue of student rights and athletes' rights is to make a strict comparison to, how player unions work outside in the professional world. I mean, let's just toss that to the side because I do believe that it's a bit of sophistry. Think about a world where Duke athletes can across sports can elect representatives on their own that are current students that can have the power to interact with the powers of the university on a direct level to the board and a direct level to the president, and actually force and have the university forced to negotiate with the players about what the proper balance should be between their athletic life and their student life. I mean, if the university were actually forced to negotiate those things with players, is there anybody watching this now who thinks that the balance after that negotiation would be exactly similar to what the balance is right now? Of course not. If the university was forced to balance those things out with a group that was duly elected by the students, and the coaches and the professors were then bound to the output or the results of that negotiation, it's hard to believe that that balance would look the way that it looks right now. And while somebody might not call that necessarily a labor union, I would call that a union of athletes who have won the right to negotiate the balance between their work life and their athletic life. So, there's no need to actually mimic, a construct that looks like the MLB Players Union or the NFL Players Union or even the U.S. Women's National Team Players Union. I think it would be better for all the athletes if they actually had an opportunity to negotiate and help dictate their own destiny. And isn't that something that we would want for our sons and for our daughters and for your friends? Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that very, very insightful. I want to shift a little bit to imagining a world where NIL is fair game and legal in the NCAA context, and specifically regarding group licensing. So for those who aren't totally informed, group licensing, whether for video games or trading cards or other items, over time has become a responsibility of the professional, at least in the professional sports unions.
Yep.
And so over the last few years, the NFLPA has actually been a leader in forming cross-sport partnerships with other players' associations to come together and collectivize player group licenses. One example of this occurred in 2017 with the formation of Rep Worldwide, and then more recently in 2019 with One Team Partners. So, Dee, I'd love to see if you could give some insight to if and when college athletes are able to profit off of their NIL rights. Do you see a company like One Team in a position to help college athletes enter the group licensing market?
Well, the simple answer to that question is yes, because we created One Team as sort of the next evolution of how we view player rights. So, to make sure that everybody's level set on the importance of player rights, think about it this way. The Madden game was something that we've utilized as probably the best example of the power of collective player rights in professional sports. All of the players in the National Football League belong to a group licensing right. We have a wholly owned subsidiary called Players Inc. that takes those collective rights and we sell them in the marketplace. But before we could sell them in the marketplace, this union had to actually fight the National Football League for those rights. There was a time historically when the National Football League owned the name, image, and likeness of players. And I would equate that to them owning a person. Think about it. I mean, can you imagine a team that could sell your face, sell your name, sell your likeness without compensating you for it? We can all imagine it because we just call it the NCAA. So there was a time when we, as the NFL Players Association, wrestled those rights back from each other. And by the way, so did the U.S. Women's National Team. They wrestled their rights back away from them. The WNBA players wrestled their rights back away from the league, and ultimately so did the NBA players, wrestled their NIL rights back from management. In order to put that further in perspective, We're a labor union that doesn't run on any of our players' dues money. The revenue that we generate from our players' group licensing rights not only pays my salary, but pays the salary of over 100 employees here. It pays for all of our legal battles, which we have. It pays for all of the work of Players Inc. to generate that revenue. And we actually write checks back to all of our players each and every year for those rights. So to say that those rights are not valuable beyond the fact that it represents what it means to be a human, they have value in the marketplace. And that's a value that should go back and inure to the benefit of the people who are actually doing the work. So, to me, the model is there. I do believe that one team sports and one team partners can be a valuable asset there. But imagine a world where instead of all of that money just going into the fund that the university controls, that we have a world where, let's just say that if you are a 2-year, 3-year player, that money goes into a trust. If you graduate, you get that money after you leave. Or better yet, it's money where groups of representatives of players and athletes in college can actually decide where they want that money to go. So to me, it's not so much a question of are some sports going to generate more revenue than others? Are some athletes going to get paid more than others? We live in a world where Tom Brady probably sells more jersey than a backup long snapper. Guess what? Nobody in our business has a problem with that because it's dictated by what consumers want to buy. When the NCAA throws up sham arguments like that, it is what it is. It's a sham. So I think it's more important to focus on why don't we put the power into the hands of the people who are actually doing the work and let them decide what they think is best for their sisters and brothers.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Moving on to my last question of this segment before we turn it over to Justin with the CBA process segment. I want to get your thoughts on the NFL's college requirement, specifically concerning the NFL's eligibility restriction that requires players to be 3 years removed from high school in order to be eligible to be drafted. Yeah. A number of advocates of NCAA reform promote the importance of the educational part of the college athlete's experience, and where 3 years is insufficient for the athletes to obtain a degree and its associated benefits with that experience. And at the same time, other proponents of NCAA reform advocate for a more free market system without such restrictions blocking eligibility, and instead prefer a more merit-based system, letting the teams decide which players are more worthy of a roster spot. I know many will agree that a player like Trevor Lawrence could improve an NFL team today. So yep. My question is given that eligibility rules are collectively bargained between the league and the union, what are your thoughts on the eligibility rules moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one where I can tell you personally, I've gone round and round. There's a part of me that certainly wants to create incentives for players to get their degrees. That's one of the reasons why we, as Cari may have mentioned, we have such a valuable education benefit for our players. At the same time, however, I work in a multi-billion-dollar business, and again, it would be hypocritical for me to somehow say that this is somehow less a business. I guess I would put it this way: those are really hard questions that I think I would rather hear from a group of students who are actually elected to represent college athletes across the spectrum, because I think that their voice and their perspective is really important. So that's number one. And number two, I find it a little rich, though, that the folks at the NCAA throw that argument out at a time when they refuse to allow a group of people to represent the class of athletes to have a voice about what it means to be a student in a athletic or college athletic paradigm, where we all know that there is a tremendous amount of pressure to perform on the field. So why don't we try to fix that part first, and leave the sham arguments to come second? As you know from this presentation, I'm probably never going to work for the NCAA. I think that's probably safely off the list of any sort of career in the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve, for answering those questions. And Justin, we'll turn it over to you.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
Sorry, I was permanently muted. Thank you, Dee. We appreciate your candid thoughts on the NCAA, even if it might forfeit your ability to be employed there in the future.
Yeah, yeah. I'll write you a note. You'll be fine. You'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for that. I want to transition to the recent CBA agreement. First, congratulations on successfully negotiating a new deal. It's been a long time since 2011, the last deal. When do you start thinking about and preparing for the negotiations, and what goes into the process to develop a strategy for those negotiations?
Great question. One big giant step back, I guess, too, would be collective bargaining is not for the faint of heart. It is necessarily messy. It is convoluted. It is very difficult. Because on one hand, you're trying to figure out what are the interests, what are the hierarchy of issues that are important to your membership, and we spend a lot of time with our membership focusing on, okay, what's important to you? Why is it important? How do we figure these things in the hierarchy of things that we're trying to achieve? On the other side, the equal, if not, somewhat more difficult task is I negotiate against 31 billionaires who are used to getting their way. Collective bargaining is the closest thing to literal hand-to-hand combat that you can find in the law or in the employee-employer paradigm. So we went through a very tough, very contentious bargaining session. And by the way, that's fine. I am fine with democracy being messy. I am fine with certainly players expressing their opinion. But at the end of the day, the most important thing that we have going for us in collective bargaining is leadership. And for me, I insist on players negotiating the deal. I don't think that anything is beyond the keen or understanding of players who want to do the homework to figure out how and what the issues are about. We run our union as a democracy. Minority is heard, majority rules. I certainly understand that sometimes people are frustrated if they don't get their way, and I know that there's a little bit of competition that always kind of seeps into what we do. But look, we have 2,500 to 2,800 active players that people are eligible to vote on the collective bargaining agreement. A large, the majority of our members voted for the collective bargaining agreement. A majority of our membership voted in the process. I think the ultimate ratification was by less than 70 votes. But that's democracy. I wish that everybody would have voted, and shame on them for the people who didn't. But is there really anything from that we wouldn't want in our own democracy. We want informed people making decisions. We want our citizens to vote. We want to make sure that we do everything so that they can vote. There is not an inkling of question in my mind about whether our membership understood and knew how to vote and had an opportunity to vote. So at the end of the day, I think collective bargaining boils down to the willingness of your leadership to roll up their sleeves and dive into the process, and their willingness to weigh, a compromise on the issues versus what might happen if you don't agree to the terms that are on the table. And by the way, I'm fine with either. I don't play, and most importantly, I don't vote. I don't get a vote for the collective bargaining agreement. So if a majority of our players want to go to war and not agree to what the deal is on the table, then let's go. I mean, I'm probably more built for that than compromise. But is it also my job and my duty to say it's a war we may not win if we're not ready to live without football for 2 years? So I would much rather our membership make sober, deliberate choices about what's on the line. But once they've made a decision about what's on the line and what they want to do, it's my job to effectuate their will.
Thank you for that. And the implication of not coming to an agreement was heightened in March when the negotiations were happening. COVID was just starting to infiltrate sports. Some were canceling. There was talk of trying to renew some of the network deals that are set to expire soon. Did those two factors play a role in trying to reach an agreement at the time you did?
I don't know. I think that, certainly from where I was sitting, did I think that it was a deal that we should have taken? 100%. I mean, the upsides of our deal were literally legion. The ability to lock in a percentage of revenue for the long term that, by the way, is impervious to downturns in the market. That issue alone was important to me. We could all spend, a few hours, in a scintillating discussion about force majeure. But, the players in our league had the advantage of very favorable force majeure language that, by the way, can't be changed for the term of our deal. So, before you get to the percentage of revenue, before you get to the benefits, before you get to the changes in our work rules, the increase in benefits to former players, before you get to all of the things that we would obviously put in the plus column, all of you are going to be lawyers one day, like your professor and I, and the tough part about being a lawyer is, when you're a student, you can sort of kind of trick yourself into this, again, sort of sophistry of, well, I'll just simply do what my client wants me to do. And that way I don't have to wrestle with, what I should do. What you learn when you become a lawyer is you're not just a hired gun. Your clients are going to rely on you to actually give them counselor advice, or, if we were in La Cosa Nostra, it would be consigliere advice on what we should do. And what you should do is always going to be weighed by what might happen if you don't take, path A, path B, or path C. If you're a lawyer or a law school student and you have even a cursory understanding of force majeure, and you've got a collective bargaining agreement that's being ratified, and your force majeure provision that's in your current deal and in your prospective deal says that the NFL can't unilaterally cancel for something like COVID without nonetheless being obligated to pay the players. And that's choice A. Or choice B would be you could not go forward with the prospective deal, and you know that every lawyer on the other side wants better force majeure language that gives them more discretion about what to do if something like a worldwide pandemic threatens your business model. Which one would you want? You'd certainly want for your client to have the most favorable language for the longest amount of time. And to put something in that like that into perspective, the soccer association that was representing its players was going through a ratification of its deal at exactly the same time, or nearly exactly the same time that we were going through a ratification of ours. The ownership group in that sport pulled their deal off the table because they didn't like the force majeure language because it left them at a disadvantage. So I'm not sure to which end, COVID either impacted or didn't impact the will or the ideas of players about what they were going to vote on or not. But I do know one thing. Can you imagine a world where all of you would be asked to negotiate the most favorable deal for the players right now if we didn't have a collective bargaining agreement? We're facing a $4 billion downturn. I'm sorry, a $4 billion loss in football revenue this year. If we didn't have a deal, I think the owner's opening offer for a new CBA would be at least $2 billion less per year than what we have right now.
That's great insight. If you want to dive into the deal itself for a couple questions.
Sure.
One of the big ticket items from the owner's perspective and kind of a change from maybe a fan's perspective as well would be adding a 17th game.
Yep.
At what point did you become willing to accept the 17th game, and how do you see it, impacting the total revenue and player health concerns as well?
Yeah. One way of framing that was in the 2006 CBA. The league had a unilateral right to increase our games up to, I think, 18 to 20 games, which means under that 2006 CBA, the owners could have changed the number of games that the players would have been obligated to play without changing the revenue split of how much money was coming the players' way. The 2011 CBA took that unilateral right away from ownership and made that a right by the players, as did the 2020 CBA. So before we even get to the economics, we took the owner's ability to do something on their own and made it something that the players had to agree to. And the players made a decision that we would do it if the overall compensation framework went their way. So, look, I can understand people who, and I'm a little hard on sports announcers because sometimes they just kind of myopically and overly, in an overly simplistic way, like to frame things. We took something that we didn't have the right to, obtained the right to do it, and ultimately got paid for it. And to me, that just becomes a question to the players of whether the compensation model was worth what they got. So for us, we secured a higher share of revenue up to 1.5 points. In our world, that translates easily to over $1 billion of cash and benefits over the life of the deal. We got better benefits for former players. We got better benefits for our current membership. We increased our ability to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our players, and we were able to secure a long-term deal at a time when basketball, baseball, and I know this is near and dear to all of us, March Madness had already shut down. So, for us, it's not so much a question of whether D. Smith thinks it's a good deal or not. We lay out the terms for our players. I certainly give them advice on whether I think it's worth it or not. But ultimately, it comes down to whether a majority of the players view this as something that was an upside, and whether or not they were going to ratify the deal, and they did.
Thank you. There's one last quick question on this point. Like you said, you received a litany of things kind of in exchange for that 17th game to receive value. The AR increase, minimum salary increases, better health benefits, narrowed drug policy. Was there one of those things that player reps or players themselves seemed to care most about that made them intrigued by the deal?
Yeah, I don't think so. I love our guys to death. We have, again, we probably had 2,800 people voting on the deal. One way I like to describe our membership sometimes is, we can have roughly 2,500 players and probably 4,500 different opinions. So it's not easy to kind of pinpoint one thing over the other. And frankly, I don't counsel our players to make the deal about one thing. We were able to, for example, there was a time in the National Football League where it took 4 years to vest. So there were a class of players historically that played for 3 years, didn't reach that 4th year to vest, and as a result were never able to enjoy the benefits of players who had played for 4 years. In this deal, we were able to reach back in time to take care of players who played only 3 years at a time when it took 4 years to vest, and to take those group of players and then bring everybody up to a pension level based on 2011. Name me one union in the world that has the ability to go back in time, nunc pro tunc, as it were, and carry a group of people forward to a point in time where their benefits and their pensions are at a rate at a point in time in the future than where they were in the past. And so I know that there was a group of players who thought that that was really, really important for the deal. I also am not kidding myself. There's probably a group of players who didn't care about that at all. To me, it's about the totality of the deal. And I want our players to make decisions based on the totality. And the only other thing I would add to that is I would hope that our players don't make decisions that are purely selfish about themselves, about where they are. And thankfully, I have the opportunity still to lead a group of players, a group of men who constantly think about the players of the past, and who are also thinking about players of the future.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comments and insight on that. We're now going to turn it over to the question and answers. We have some people in the audience who submitted questions. So Shira, I'll turn it over to you for that.
Yeah, I can go ahead and turn it over to our first question will be David Duquette. David, your turn.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Dee.
Welcome.
Really appreciate it. My name is David Duquette. I'm a current 1L at Duke Law. And my question is, you kind of actually were just alluding to it, but the NFL has such a diverse group of players with a lot of different priorities and interests. College athletes have that problem kind of on steroids a little bit.
Yeah.
And its players obviously are only in school for 4 years. So I guess what advice would you give to college athletes that would help them solve whatever collective action problems might come up in their collective bargaining negotiations?
Well, that's a great question, and it does make it tough my advice to college athletes, and I say this as a dad who has shuffled his kid off to a D1 scholarship, is think about the world that you would want for the players in your locker room after you've left. I think, some of the best lessons that my son has learned, some of the best lessons I learned as even, an awful athlete, thanks, Cari, was to leave the locker room better than the way you found it. And it's tough because there's such fast transition in college sports. And frankly, that's something that the NCAA excels at taking advantage of, right? I mean, as long as they keep the discussion going, as long as they don't make decisions, the issue just keeps rolling forward and forward and forward. So, my advice to people who care about this would be, not so much to try to solve all of the major problems, that are inherent in college athletics. Focus on the problems and the issues that are important to the athletes at your university right now. And probably one of the ones that are on the forefront is, how do I, as an athlete, balance my obligations as an athlete against my obligations as a student? And is there a better world, a better life, or a better balance for all of us? And how do we force the university to engage us, not as a advisory group, but as a group that has the power to dictate the will of the athletes and the students who are there? And that's where I would start.
All right. Next, we'll turn it over to Caitlin Ray. Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Ray. I'm a 3L at Duke Law School. Dee, thank you for being here. And Professor Grieb, it's so good to see you. We hope we get you back for winter session this year, even if it's virtual. But Dee, I'd like to speak to something you just mentioned, which is this imbalance between your work life, sports, and non-work life academics. And I imagine you have a great sense of that imbalance from the men you work with every day, but I imagine that takes on a new meaning in your relationship with your son. And so what insights have you gained as a father, kind of seeing him experience that imbalance? And how would you address kind of the tensions between the intensity of athletics and coaches' incentives and then rigorous academics on the other hand?
Yeah, great question. First and foremost, my wife and I are lucky enough to have a daughter, so we don't really care about our son. So that helps. I guess I would probably, the best lesson is just seeing and appreciating the reality of it, right? And we're not going to kid each other. I'm not going to say that athletes don't want to play. I'm not going to say that athletes don't want to practice. I mean, our guys in the NFL would play in an empty stadium in the dark if they could. And even though I was a lousy athlete, I enjoyed every minute of running track in college. So the reality of it is you have a bunch of forces where some of the people involved are complicit, right? They just are. So I don't want to make this sound like I'm just simply demonizing the coaches or demonizing the administration. I guess what I would say, though, is you are taking advantage of a group of people who want to do what they're doing. But what you're also doing is, by taking advantage of that, you're also not giving them the opportunity to be empowered to bring about change. And so, I would be the last dad who would, tell my son, you're going to have some sort of work stoppage, or, you're going to, write something on your helmet, which I have, by the way, that says Maryland on it, in case you were questioning it. But you would never say, let's burn down, what you love in the hope of trying to make a statement. What I would tell him is, man, have a very real understanding of what you're going into and what you're getting into. And the most important people that you're going to meet there are going to be the people that you're playing with, and and the people that you're going to meet at your university, and they're not all bad, but I know that you would practice in 20 feet of snow, 30 below, with, you know, a torn rotator cuff. I know you would do it. But if you want to leave your locker room better for the people who come after you, what kind of steps can you take now in order to give them more of a voice than you might have right now? And to me, that, again, that's not so much trying to take on the NCAA and to slay that dragon, you know, in your 4 years. But think about, for example, you know, I see the card behind you, the painting behind you about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Think about the history of women in this country who just chipped away every day against a sexist society that treated them as less. By the way, even in the law, right? Let's not kid ourselves. Who chipped away at that over decades. You know, Cari knows that I'm fond of talking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and what that means for unions. In a nutshell, 30 seconds. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory burned down in the early 1900s in New York City in the early 1900s. All of the victims in that factory were women and children who had the fire escapes blocked, the doors sealed shut, and for the people who burned to death, there were also people, children and women who jumped to their death. Well, every time you see an exit sign, and every time you see a fire escape, and every time you see rules about child labor, every American should tip their cap to a group of women after that fire who forced changes in the workplace, changes in health and safety, ended child labor. And most of those people were women who formed unions in the early 1900s to force a change. And here's the kicker: at a time when they didn't have the right to vote. So if you want to put it all in perspective, it's all about having the desire and the will and the steadfast nature of trying to make the world and their sweatshop or their shirtwaist factory better for the people who came afterwards, in the same way that you and your fellow athletes and fellow lawyers and fellow students should try to make their locker rooms and their classrooms better for the people who come afterwards. And by the way, nobody should measure whether or not you win by what happens in your school year or your 4 years or even the 20 years that comes after it. Everybody should measure the win against the resolve of the people who've committed themselves to do it. And to have a group of law school students who've decided that they're going to form, you know, a group of people who care about the future of college sports, that tells me that we're already winning, right? Because all of you, you know, hopefully when you leave, I think the greatest thing that you can give, in addition to doing what you're doing right now, is wherever you are next year after you graduate, 5 years after you graduate, hopefully you guys will infiltrate the NCAA and infiltrate your universities. But more importantly, all of you will have the same desire to make things better, even though you're not at Duke Law School anymore, right?
Thanks for your insights, Dee.
You're welcome.
All right, and for the last question, we'll turn it over to Tim Hazen.
Hey, Tim.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Dee, for being here, and Professor Grieb, Zack, and Justin for organizing this discussion. My name's Tim Hazen. I'm a 2L at UIC Law in Chicago. My question is in regards to athlete biometric data.
Yep.
Wearable technology in sports is continuing to evolve. The biometric data collected from wearable technology poses various benefits, but also raises unprecedented privacy issues for athletes. Would you prefer adopting regulations of biometric data at a federal level, or is it more beneficial to athletes to regulate biometric data at a league level through their CBAs?
I think clearly the latter, and here's why. I have my concerns about how the law would develop at the federal level. I mean, once again, we talked about it already. You've got a group of athletes who don't have the ability to hire lobbyists. You've got an NCAA who does have the ability to hire lobbyists. I don't want to make it sound like that that sometimes our congressmen listen more to lawyers than students. Actually, I am saying that. So I would be somewhat concerned about how that would play out. If it does play out on the level of students who have the right to negotiate about their own intellectual property, and the other side, management, schools, sorry, not management, I meant schools. Schools would have the opportunity to where they would have to negotiate directly with the people who have the interest in the privacy of that IP. I think that's a better scenario for all of us. For us, you know, as you probably know, in our collective bargaining agreement, we have tight restrictions about how that data can be used that's gained from our players. But also one giant step backwards, because of our collective group licensing rights, we made a decision, I think back in 2017, to partner with a small company that was getting into the biodata space. That company is called Whoop, and we made a $0 investment in Whoop in exchange for an equity position. So today, now we fast forward where Whoop is no longer just a small startup. Not only have the players benefited from that investment, but as equity holders in that, we have the direct ability to have somewhat of a say in how that biodata is being used. And we certainly have the ability to collectively bargain over it as the exclusive bargaining agent for our players. So, it seems to me that any metric or paradigm that allows a more fair balance between the people who are negotiating for a certain right and theoretically people who might be wanting to negotiate against it, as long as there's somewhat equal footing between those two parties, you want those two parties to be able to try to meet it out and try to find a fair balance. And if the students, the representation, the group of the students decide that they want to allow the student or the group or the university to monetize those rights, then fine. If they decide that they don't want them to do it, fine. But more importantly, we wouldn't want a world where someone is able to gather all of that data. And frankly, that's what's happening in the NCAA right now. All of the biometric data that is being gathered from players that are using, are forced to use tracking devices on the field. I don't know where that data is going. The athletes don't know where that data is going. But there is a perverse incentive, right, for someone to sell that data to someone who might think it's valuable. And not only is none of the proceeds going to the student, we're in a world where actively they're losing their privacy right to that data without ever having a say in it. And to me, that's the worst offense.
Thank you very much to Tim, Caitlin, and David for the great questions. That's going to be the close of our Q&A session as our time has run up. Dee, we so greatly appreciate your time and insight you've given us today. It's been wonderful. We want to give you the last word if there's anything about a topic we haven't touched or anything else you'd like to mention as we close out.
Sure. Look, first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity of doing this. And Cari, thank you for, making sure and facilitating this. I think I would close on this. We have the opportunity as lawyers and as law school students and future lawyers to dictate our own destiny. And I think the worst thing that we could all do is to accept the paradigm that exists as the one that needs to exist in the future. All of us have benefited from people who have gone before us, whether it's late Supreme Court justices like Justice Ginsburg or late Supreme Court justices like Thurgood Marshall. Before they were Supreme Court justices, they were law school students. And I firmly believe that they didn't find their moxie about changing the paradigm once they became a Supreme Court justice. Somewhere in their history, they found the willingness and the resolve to not accept paradigms for what they are, but to accept them for something that could be changed. And we're at a time in our country where we all need you more today than frankly we probably ever needed a group of people who wanted to change and make their country and to make all of us a more perfect union than today. So thank you for being so patient, allowing me to ramble on about ridiculous things. But thank you for taking the time, and most importantly, thank you for caring about the future of college athletes. My son will probably never say thank you, so I'll say thank you for him. Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll catch you next time. Hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday. Take care.